now he has a member state meeting or something about Cambodia. So unfortunately he can't cancel this. He sends his regard and apologizes. So we're having a panel, unfortunately, without Unido, which is a big miss, but maybe it's possible that he can make his presentation tomorrow, so we don't lack this information. Okay, so we start with the soil, with you, Mr. Bodner, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and well, it's a pleasure to me to talk to such an international audience, to bring you, well, let's say some ideas around soil sustainability. As you see, I'm coming from the Department of Agriculture, of Crop Production at the Agricultural University here in Vienna, so my point of view on soils is mainly related to the production function of soils. So most of my ideas are somehow related to crop production and soils. And what you can also see on these initial slides, I'm working in a kind of field where crops, plants are meeting the soil. So my focus, my view on agriculture is something like a below ground view, which requires concerning both the element of soil and the element of plant. So that's a bit the background and the framework of my short presentation. If you're talking on crop production, you will very quickly come to graphs that are looking like this. So the yield trends from different statistical databases. And generally you see different patterns, and if you look on such yield trends, one pattern that you can frequently observe for several crops, and particularly in more industrialized countries, is that with the beginning of the 90s you have something like a decreasing yield trend or production trend. This is something that you will not observe everywhere. Here you see a comparative curve for China, where this is not that evident. But anyway, you have several crops where you see this decreasing production trends. A second issue that you will frequently see is if you relate production trends with input trends, you can see that most of the success story on yield from the 60s onwards is an intensification-driven success story. And intensification-driven success stories certainly have implications for environment, which you can easily visualize with greenhouse gas emissions. But you could also take other indicators where you can see that certainly this success story on the crop side has costs in terms of the environment. By the way, here these graphs show just two examples, of these big export nations, which are Germany and China. If you look on the curves for least development countries, they look completely different. In least developed countries, you have a rather low yield increase, more or less until the 90s, and then you have a pretty steep increase. That is something certainly that you can discuss, but it shows you that this intensification-driven strategy did not arrive everywhere. So there were several concerns concerning this intensification green revolution strategy. One concern were environment, and another concern was that it was not everywhere a success story. And last but not least, you have this decreasing trend, so you have to think in different options how you can still keep a path of the yield increase with population increase. So that's a bit the general framework where we are discussing a lot in future strategies for crop production. Now, what makes sense for discussion is what is a maximum potential of biomass production. Is agriculture already on a top level, or is there still a chance for improvement? And this table somehow helps you to discuss this topic. So here what you can see is the output, the productivity of different ecosystems, natural ecosystems, in different environments. Where you can see, as you know, that tropical rainforests have a pretty high net primary production. Then you have different natural ecosystems in dry environments. You have the productivity in cold environments. and you have an average number for agricultural plantations. And what you can see is that the net primary production of agricultural plantations currently is more or less at the level of xeric scrubland. What does this mean? From this point of view, you have still chances to increase the primary production in agriculture. So you have to think why the productivity is not higher. And there are different explanations for this. One explanation that you can see on this graph is that agricultural plantations are not like natural ecosystems. They lose something of the incoming energy, that means sunlight. Often you work with annual plants, you have to establish them until their green cover is completely closed and they can intercept all of the radiation. You need some time. Also you have crops that will not close their rows, so there's a lot of losses in between the crops. And last but not least, you do not crop all over the year. Even for our temperate ecosystems, there are extreme examples where you harvest cereals in the mid of July, and possibly in a normal crop rotation, you seed maize in the next year, that would be on the beginning of May, and you have more or less 8 months where you have nothing on your field. So you lose all the incoming sunlight. So from this point of view of the interception of sunlight, you can think in strategies to improve your productivity. But then you will come on a second issue, this is related to soil. There are a lot of constraints in terms of soil productivity, in terms of soil resources that can limit crop production. I tried to put together some of these constraints in the soil in terms of the limitation of global agroecosystems. And what I want to point you is, first of all, that about 1/3 of world soils, of arable soils, where either water or phosphorus is limiting. So there's a lot of cropland where these key resources are limiting. Why we have to think in a lot of in ways to increase efficiency in these resources? First of all, because they're limiting, and second, because there will not be any good possibilities to increase the input in agriculture. If you think in water, agriculture is using more or less 75–80% on a worldwide scale. So water is also a drinking water, so we cannot claim that we can put more water to agriculture to increase irrigation. For phosphorus, you have a similar problem. Phosphorus is a limiting resource. There are expectations that you will have a peak somewhere in the next few decades, so the access to mining phosphorus reserves is decreasing. That means we have to think in better efficiency. What I want to point also here is there are some new soil limitations which are related to modern agriculture, mainly like soil compaction. That's an upcoming problem in like the highly developed agriculture with heavy machineries, and soil compaction is becoming increasingly a limitation from the soil side. That means overall, if you consider these soil limitations, we are estimating that actually currently we are taking more or less just 40% of the environmental potential out of our crops. So there is chance to improve. If you're talking on agricultural soil, on agricultural production and on chances to improve, we have to think where we can improve. What you can see on this scheme is you have some classical measures in agriculture that are taking place everywhere. So first of all, a farmer is deciding on his crop rotation, which crops he is growing on his field. Then a second option is how he gives nutrients to these crops. That means all the fertilization story. Then the fourth issue is how he protects his plants, plant protection. The next one is breeding, how the farmer chooses his varieties, which varieties he chooses. And then you have a large part of farmer decisions which are related to soil, tillage measures. So these are more or less the measures a farmer is deciding when he starts to crop his field. And if you're discussing options to improve something, you have to look where in these measures you have losses, where you have inefficiencies, and what you can do. And I want to focus a bit on the soil issue today. That means all these below ground influences that farmers are doing during their practices. If you look in like traditional green revolution, high input farming, you can see that you have pretty high increase in mechanization. So one story of the green revolution success story is mechanization. There's more capital on the farms today compared to other times. Certainly this is something that you will not find everywhere in the world, but mainly in parts of the world. A second issue what I want to point to, and that I showed you already before, is high input. So you have soil limitation. If you have soil limitation in some nutrients, the easiest way is you put these nutrients from mineral fertilizers. And you can see this was part of the success story because we have a more or less 5.5 per year increase in mineral fertilizer inputs. And also for other inputs, you will see this like intensification-driven traditional management strategy. So the question is, what can we do in future? Is this sustainable? And in this context, they came up what probably most of you heard is this sustainable crop production intensification story. Sustainable crop production intensification does not mean nothing else than making better use of the natural resources. Natural resources in terms of soil fertility, in terms of resource uptake, in terms of use of natural biodiversity, genetic resources. So this is more or less the general context where we are discussing now what can be future strategies to intervene in agricultural decisions, crop rotations, varieties, plant nutrition, soil management, and how we can do it more sustainable while maintaining a high level of yield. And in this context, evidently, soil management is one of the key issues. So when we're thinking in like soil quality, we're claiming that soil quality is the key resource in order to ensure stable and high yields. When we're discussing soil quality and what we can change, what we can improve, it often makes sense to define a bit more what is soil quality, and you could subdivide it in something that I would call physical soil quality. This is everything which is related to water storage, to air in the soil that crops need in order to grow well, as well as to soil temperature. So these are physical properties in the soil related to the soil water and the air issue first of all, that make up a big deal of the productivity story of crops. Then you can define something that you might call chemical soil fertility. That's everything related to nutrients. And last but not least, there's something that I would call biological soil fertility. For me, this biological soil fertility is a key issue because of two reasons. One of the reasons is it's the most sensitive part of soil fertility. So when you intervene as a farmer in your soil, the first thing that you will see that it changes, it reacts, either positive or negative, is a biological side. And secondly, the biological side is largely influencing the chemical and the physical side. So it's something that you can manage and where you can improve or degrade something. So focus on this biological side of soil fertility is something very important. Why it is important? Often when you speak to farmers, they ask you, okay, what can I improve? And if you look on world soil maps concerning constraints in soil productivity, unfortunately the story is very simple. If you look on such a map, you can see what are the limiting factors in world soils, and the story is very easy. Here you have the tropical highly weathered soils that are weathered over millions of years, and they are having a very, very low chemical productivity because they're very acidic, and most of them are phosphorus deficient. Then you have a broad range of soils where water is a limiting factor, which are the big dry belts in the world. Then you have a lot of soils that are limited by temperature. Then you have some soils that are limited by the geological substrate, that means these yellow ones, which are sandy soils. And then you have countries or continents that have good luck, they have very young soils after the ice ages. These young soils are pretty fertile. But what is the problem of this story? These are natural factors that influence soil productivity that you will not change. I cannot change a sandy soil towards a clay soil. I cannot change a soil that is weathered over millions of years, that it becomes a young soil. So when you discuss on improving something, you have to focus on soil properties that you can change. And just within this framework of properties that you can change, you can improve something. And from my point of view, there are two basic issues where soil management in a farming context can focus on, because they are very sensitive and they tend to be degraded in a lot of agricultural soils. One is soil structure. Soil structure, something related to the physical part of soil fertility, something related to the air capacity of soils, which is very important for the early vigor of plants, something related also to erosion control, because if you have a good, stable soil structure, water can infiltrate quickly and you do not lose your water. So this is something where we know that it is very sensitive to management, and the other part is organic matter. We also know that agricultural soils generally have a lower organic matter compared to pasture and woodland and natural ecosystems. So this is the second part where we know that management has an influence and where we can do something. And both of these issues are very strongly related to the biological part of soil fertility. I'm not sure how long still. I have a few more slides, but okay. So one of the issues that we are strongly focusing is how we can optimize the use of the available resources. When you're analyzing efficiencies and inefficiencies in a system, okay, you have natural constraints that you will not change, but you can have losses within these natural constraints. That means in terms of water, if you have a dry ecosystem and you do not optimize the water use, from the available water resources, you're losing something. So you can improve your efficiency. Or if you have a soil that is deficient in phosphorus, you have to think in ways how you can improve the uptake. And the root system is some of the key elements of a crop in order to optimize resource use. So why the root system is so interesting for us? First of all, we know it's an interplay between soil and plants. So it makes up a big deal of the efficiency story for crop production systems. And second, from the point of view of research, it's something where we still do not know a lot about it. For example, I recently saw an article where they said that more or less we know 80% of the species above ground, but we just know hardly 20% of the species and microorganisms below ground. So we are not very far away to perfectly understand this system. And if we do not understand something, we always have problems to manage it, to change it. So there's also a big issue for research in order to better understand the root-soil interactions in order to make them manageable for agriculture. And to finalize, well, that's more or less the brain of a scientist at midnight. This is more or less the idea that I have around root management. The issue is pretty simply explained. So here again, you have all your management decisions that the farmer is doing. And the general point of view we had is, okay, you fertilize and you increase yield. So the amount of fertilization is something that in your research you directly study in terms of yield. But from my point of view, you have to understand this part between your management decision and the yield outcome. And this part in between is the interplay between the biological soil fertility and the root. This is making up a lot of your efficiencies that up to now we were mainly looking indirectly, and now we should see how we can improve this part in the management. I just want to finalize with giving you two examples. One example for the phosphorus side. So you've seen that a lot of soils in the world are phosphorus limiting. That's mainly the strongly weathered soils in the tropics and subtropics. So there phosphorus is one of the limiting resources. And if you're looking on how a plant is acquiring phosphorus, mainly under deficiency conditions, the plant has a lot of strategies how to improve the uptake. So there are a lot of biological issues involved, how plants are intervening in the soil in order to better extract, to better dissolve phosphorus resources and to optimize the uptake. There's a lot of microbiology involved, mycorrhiza, different soil bacteria, a lot of organic acids that help the plant in order to overcome this deficiency. And this is something that we have to include in our management decisions. And we have a lot of experiments that demonstrate that when we run out of phosphorus in our soil analysis, this does not necessarily imply that the plant runs out of phosphorus, because it starts to react biologically. And I suppose that there's a big deal still to improve the efficiency of our systems. The same story you can find also defined for the water part, and that's really my last slide. We're discussing currently now a lot how we can improve varieties, how we can change crop breeding in order to achieve better efficiency of our crops. And breeders, if someone comes from breeding, breeders always have like 100, 500 plots and they compare them. So for the roots issue, this is something that is pretty challenging, because root methods were something very laborious. You have to take out soil samples, you wash them. So it's nothing that has a throughput that the breeder can use. But there's a lot of technological development under the framework of plant phenotyping, using non-destructive imaging methods, where we can try to improve our knowledge on the root system and bring it towards the breeders in order to improve the root system systematically of new cultivars, of new varieties, and thereby improves their resource efficiency. So this would be two examples where I would be like positively minded that we can improve the efficiency of our cropping system concerning to limiting resources, and there's still a lot of things we can do and we can improve. So this is more or less some of the ideas that I would put forward in terms of soil productivity, fertility, and crop production system. And I'm open and interested to find and hear other ideas. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gernot. Yeah, a very impressive speech. Like I said in my opening speech, I'm not a soil expert. Now I think I know more about soils and feeling like I become one. Very impressive. I will look forward to your questions later. And yes, I'm looking forward to your presentation, Joseph. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you again about nuclear techniques and isotopes. As you all know, even in this room, there are a lot of isotopes, whether we like it or not. We are smelling them. We don't see them, but we need to use them. They are really very, very important for us. So what I'll be talking about is on nuclear techniques for food security and environmental sustainability. What can nuclear techniques do for us, actually, to help us to make sure that we identify some of the techniques that will help us actually to improve productivity. For the presentation, this morning we heard more about nuclear techniques, and some of the techniques were mentioned. I will concentrate on the techniques in soil, water, nutrient, crop management, because from the soil, the water, the nutrient, we have to look at it from very holistic approach to be able to solve some of the problems. And I will talk about crop water use. Emphasis will be more on soil erosion and conservation practices. I will also talk about agriculture, water pollutants, and food security, and how nuclear techniques will actually help us to identify some of these pollutants and then get good management practices to arrest some of the problems. Now you could see that from this point of view, you realize that now for conservation agriculture, when you go to some places in Africa, you see really a desert area there, and then you find out that productivity is really seriously affected. But actually, with very good conservation, with water, where they have a watershed, you'll be able now to combine these two, and then you actually create some sort of high productivity. So this is what I will call from gray to green, where the place is really very, very gray. You cannot produce anything. And now with good fertilizer management, as my earlier colleagues have said, with water, very good water, you have a high productivity. And that is what I call gray to green. So the place is so dry, with good management and with water, you're going to have a green revolution. Now, what does that entail? Let's see how isotopes can help us to reach this point. Now, when we talk of the nuclear techniques in soil and water management, you realize that we talk of water, fertilizer, nutrient use efficiency, and then also how we can enhance crop yield. And as it was mentioned, we talk about nitrogen 15, carbon 13, oxygen 18, and now also the oxygen level for phosphate. You all know that phosphorus has no stable isotopes. So we are now trying to see the effect of trying to see the oxygen in the phosphate as a surrogate. And then the cosmic ray neutron sensor, which was also mentioned this morning, to be able to measure the soil water at a very big area, not a point measurement. I will also talk about the assessments and magnitude of soil erosion, and then the use of cesium 137, lead 210, and beryllium, and of late CSSI. People talk of soil erosion and they say, what is soil erosion? We don't care if the soil is eroded. What is my business? But it's not the soil that is getting eroded, but the soil is eroding with a lot of nutrients. Your topsoil is going away. So very soon, as my previous speaker said, very soon your soil will be rendered almost nothing, and you cannot grow anything. So we should always remember that when we talk of soil erosion, it's not just the soil going away, but your nutrients, very important nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they are all going away. We will also talk about the legumes and cereals with high nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is very important. But everybody knows that we grow legumes without putting fertilizer there. So people realize that legumes can have their own nitrogen, or they can capture their own nitrogen. But the question is, how much do they capture? You need to measure it if actually you want to incorporate them into the cropping systems to make sure that actually you build your nitrogen capital. Sometimes the legumes also help actually to build the phosphorus capital by also releasing some acids to dissolve some of the phosphorus, as we said. Now we also use the carbon 13, that is the CO2, and then the nitrous oxide for greenhouse gases, which is also very important for climate change. And then recently we are working on monitoring sources and transport of agropollutants. These are mainly nutrients and pesticides, and how we can use different forms of isotopes in the analysis to make sure that we are able to trace some of these pollutants. Now from here, you realize the nuclear techniques to evaluate crops for their ability to fix nitrogen. Most of the crops, as you know, when you pull a legume, you see these nodules around. These are the ones that really help to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So if the legume fixes more nitrogen, it means that you don't need to add more nitrogen. That means that the more we incorporate legumes into the cropping systems, the more we add nitrogen into the ecosystem. But the question is, how much nitrogen is being added into the system? So now I brought this one to see that you see the importance of legumes. We have all different types of legumes. And this morning, as somebody said, if we want to actually reduce the water footprint, we should probably make eating meat, which has a high water footprint. And legumes are, or sometimes they were labeled as a poor man's meat, but now it is also the rich man's meat, because for healthy reasons, many people want to go in for legumes instead of meat. And we have a simple system where we use nitrogen 50 to be able to determine the amount of nitrogen that is fixed by the crop. It's not just a matter of saying that the legume fixes the crop. Which legume fixes much nitrogen, and which variety fixes more nitrogen? So here, breeders will want to know which of these legumes fix more nitrogen, so that when they are incorporated into the cereal-based cropping systems, we don't really mind the soil. So we use the N15 to be able to assess or quantify the amount of nitrogen that is fixed by these legumes. In terms of fertilizer use, we all know that even though we put a lot of fertilizer into the system, the plant doesn't take all the fertilizer, depending on the soil management. And when these fertilizers are not taken up by the plant, what happens? They either leach into the system, or they are actually lock up in the soil, which is a waste to the farmer. So what is the need for the farmer to put 100 kg of nitrogen and the plant is taking only about 40 or 50 kg and the rest is lost? If the rest is lost, it is an economic loss to the farmer, but also to the government, where some of these fertilizers turn out to be pollutants, and then they affect our drinking water and also our groundwater. So it is very, very, very important. And what can isotope do or help in this? This is where isotope will be able to help you to know the fertilizer nitrogen use efficiency by each crop, especially for rice. In a lot of areas in Asia, people put fertilizers there. Also in Europe, people put fertilizers there. Whether the plant needs it or not, they just dump the fertilizers. This has been a problem, and it has actually affected our environment. Not only the water, but also in the soil. And here, what we do is that with this technology, we help to design experiments to be able to quantify the nitrogen used by different crops. Here is a case quite recently. I designed something for date palm, and also we have for vegetables. So now, if we know how much the plant can take, then we will as much as possible try to see that application of the fertilizers will also synchronize with the crop growth and then produce much yield. Of course, we also relate the fertilizer nitrogen use to yield, because as we all know, most farmers are not interested in our fertilizer use efficiency. They are interested in the yield. But finally, when they find out that no matter how much fertilizer they put there, I mean, if you look at the margin, they are not gaining, they are not really gaining, then they will go in for very efficient crop that uses fertilizer. Now you could see, as it was mentioned earlier, you could see some of these areas. These ones I took from Sudan, where there is flooding, and then the water is not really very used very efficiently. Now look at this sprinkler irrigation. These are some of the problems where we lose much of the water, and then when most of the water, either they leave the soil surface or they go underground, they also go with the nutrients. So here is a photo from Kenya, where the Maasai growing crops are now using the drip irrigation to produce crops, especially here in this is cabbage being grown there, with the aim of conserving water. So when they try to conserve water and also conserve nutrients, this is where we use isotopes also to identify which crop varieties are really efficient in using both water and also nutrients. Now I got this this slide from Google, and it's really very interesting. Most of you, those who have been in Africa, we know of the famous Lake Chad, and as early as 1963, the Lake Chad was really very productive, and then it was also used for recreational purposes. Now by 2001, now you see what has happened to what has really happened to the lake. The lake is drained. Either it is overuse of the water that started from the Nigerian side to produce wheat, and without trying to look at the water use, or sometimes mismanagement. I mean, clearing all the trees around the lake, and then everything is almost gone. So if we are not really very careful, this is what we will see. Most of our lakes, if we don't manage our water and the soil very, very well, finally you see that most of the lakes will disappear. So we need to know all this. Now, we also use the carbon-13 as a surrogate, also to determine the crops that are water efficient. This is based on transpiration and photosynthesis, especially for seed tree plants. So just by measuring the carbon isotope discrimination, you'll be able to determine which rice variety or which mung bean variety is very tolerant or use water very efficiently. So here you see the importance of the nuclear technique. Now, this is common management for soil water productivity. In order to improve productivity, you need to have practices that reduce evaporation and then increase crop transpiration, as we heard this morning. Efficient irrigation system, e.g. The drip irrigation system, will also help us to make sure that we use water efficiently. In some cases or in some countries where the practices that has happened was what they call the water pricing. They know that, I mean, everything that is free, people don't use it very well. So now they put high price on water, especially agricultural water, so that people will now realize that now if I use more water, I will have to pay. So I have to be very, 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 very careful when I'm using the water. Now, if you look at the last aspect of the presentation, I will talk about the soil erosion and conservation practices. We all know what really happened, the nuclear testing in 1963, and we just left all this cesium-137 and then all this lead. And this is what we are using it as a measure of soil erosion, and follow it with sediments, especially with lead-210, and then also the fall into the leaves as a beryllium-7. Now, how do we get these measurements? These fallouts happens, and then the fallouts, they move with the they attach themselves to the soil particles, and then they move, and then they deposit at a place. So by trying to take some samples from a place which is the natural environment, and then coming down to where there is the position, we are able to now estimate the amount of soil that is eroded. Compared to the old days where you have a very big field, and then you try to see how the soil will move into a tank, and then you measure it. So this is a very effective way of measuring some of these things. And as I said, you use all these cesium-137, lead-210, and then beryllium-7. But of late, now we are developing a long-term soil erosion assessment using plutonium-239 and then plutonium-240, because the cesium-137 has a short half-life, and very soon we will not be able to measure them. Now here, we also have done a lot of work, and we have produced some booklets and these things that will help our member states, and we also publish some of our work in well-refereed journal. So now we realize that they could also use this one in schools, and also people who want to measure some of these things. The last one is on the water quality. Actually, of late we are working on multiple isotope fingerprinting to identify agricultural contaminants. You know that contaminants are very, very complicated. When they move through the agricultural field, they mix up. And then when they mix up, it is very, very, very difficult to use only one isotope to be able to identify it. So now we are trying to see how best, you see the whole system the buildings are here, we have animals and producing all this, and they are getting into this water. And when they get into this water, they have isotope signatures, carbon 12, 13, 15, and others. And then you see the pollution. So finally, we are also looking at the soil contamination. As they said earlier, whenever there is a nuclear emergency, so some of these cesium goes into the plant, so we also measure them using the isotopes. We have some success stories in different countries, which I've listed just to tell you that we don't just do the work in the lab, but we also apply it in different countries. Now, this is a simple thing to tell you where you have, whatever problems you may have here, these are the isotopes and later techniques that you can use. So this will be very, very, very helpful when you get the presentation. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I welcome some questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. It's always interesting what is possible with isotopes and nucleides and everything. Yeah, I know now that you like to speak all of your departments, so next time I will care about this. So I'm really looking forward to you, Peter, to your presentation. You're going to talk about meat, as you're a specialist in meat. And yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very interesting discussion, presentation, as we have talked over the phone, and I'm really looking forward. Thank you.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, respected audience, now I lost the microphone. I need to look over the screen. I have chosen a very special topic in the food chain, in the meat chain. It's meat from wild game. It's a typical meat product, and some people might argue that it's maybe not that suitable for such an audience, but it helps us a lot to understand how food chains, how meat chains work, and what problems can occur, how they are analyzed, how they are managed. Also, it helps people which are interested in, let us say, extensive production chains. I think you all have an impression how intensive production works, but this is now a very special thing. Now, first of all, meat from wild game is a very broad thing. You see on the right side fruit bats. I did not know what a fruit bat is. I did not know the English word, the German I did know, unless I heard a lecture about fruit bats in Ghana, where they are hunted, and they are, for some people, a method to earn money, to earn good money, and they are eaten. In this case, it's a valuable protein source for people who have no other access to protein. It has specific problems as regards occupational disease and so on, but it's a part of the food chain in this country. In other countries, wild game, or some wild game species, have the role of agricultural pests. I took the crow, Corvus coronae, as you can see on the right top part of the picture, because in Europe it is recognized as an agricultural pest. You could also, instead of the crow, you could use the Egyptian grey goose in South Africa, the warthog in South Africa, the guanaco in Tierra del Fuego, the beaver in Tierra del Fuego, the beaver in Austria, blah, blah, blah. So it's quite a lot of animals, and some of them need regulation of numbers, and there always the question arises, can we eat it? Does it make any sense? And when you look at the crow in a dead condition with feathers on, you would say, by no means. When you eviscerate it and you remove the skin, then it looks this way, and then maybe you would look at it in a different way, because here it looks quite nice. I would not say it looks as nice as chicken, but if you look at the breast muscles, there is a lot of protein, which if you just kill the animal and throw it away, would be a good bait for foxes and so on. But if you want to use it in a sustainable way, you could think about this type of food. Sometimes you have a, let us say, regulated approach to meat from wild game. For example, when you keep the wild animals in fenced areas, similar like cattle, extensive farming of cattle, in this case it is red deer in Scotland. In Scotland they have a lot of meadows and meadows and meadows and meadows and hills and meadows, and there is place enough for such animals. And as the climate in Scotland is not so fine, they also have a stable. This is quite nice because the stable has then a nice short way to a stunning box and to a slaughterhouse, so the animals have to travel only 3 meters, and then they are processed and slaughtered under very hygienic conditions. You have very low investment, you need less water, you need less energy, you don't need trucks to transport the animals or the meat, and so this might be a nice way for local production of certain qualities of meat with a minimum input, but a high level of security. You have good information about the animals, you have a good level of biosecurity, you have good processing conditions, so you end up with a safe product. This is only one part of game meat production. Another part is the more hardcore part, which is more common in Central Europe, where you go out, you spot the animal, you shoot the animal. Of course, this causes some contamination. Maybe you eviscerate it in the field on the spot, which also could cause some contamination. And unlike the farmed game, it comes in the chiller in skin-on condition, and we all know that the skin and the content of the intestines are the most contaminated organs in terms of bacteria. So different settings. All of these situations have in common that we have the transformation from a nice live animal to a nice piece of meat which ends in the mouth of a consumer. And this sequence of events is called meat chain, or at least we call it that way. And this meat chain can have a formal character, which means self-supply of people, local domestic supply, or it can have a more formal character in terms of the approved meat chain. For example, the European Union has in 2004 established quite clear rules how such an approved meat chain has to be structured, and it has established that you have to assess the health condition of the animal before killing by visual inspection from a distance, of course, otherwise the animal would run away, and also after killing upon evisceration, and also laid down the responsibilities for the people involved in the whole operations. And the aim of this thing was to assure that meat from such wild animals, freely living animals, is, when it comes to the consumer, as safe as meat from cattle or swine slaughtered in a slaughterhouse. What are the main elements which need to be addressed when we want to use this type of meat as a food? These elements are not different from all the other elements we know for meat in general. First of all, we must be able to detect pathological alterations which give rise to the assumption that the meat would not be fit for human consumption or a health hazard for the people working with the carcass or the inner organs. Typically, it's macroscopic lesions. Of course, admittedly, not all infections, not all pathogenic agents cause macroscopic lesions. So this is not a 100% assurance that there is no problem. So we have a second line of defense, which means we have to prevent or control contamination. Also contamination which was initially there even before the time of killing, the so-called primary contamination. Other people would say infection, but its essence is the same. In this case, I took a very nice example of contamination. This happens when the abdominal cavity is wounded and there is an efflux of ingesta from the bowels. And the third element we have to respect is, if we want to put food on the market, there must be a clear traceability. It must be clear from where it originates, who was processing the meat, who can be liable for any problems which occur. So it's a very general approach, and I want a little bit to show how this approach is reflected in the game meat chain. First of all, it's good to know what we are talking about. Every scientist has usually a very limited scope to reality, and when you want to enhance your scope, you look then not only at a typical niche, but maybe at a sort of chain or maybe you would do it in a very complex way. In this case, I'm more linearly oriented, so it's the chain. And it means, first of all, you have to know the players, which people are involved, which people you have to address, which people need to be maybe trained or educated or asked for their opinions. The second is you have to know what happens from the live animal to the piece of meat, which processing steps occur, and especially in relation to hazards. Can biological, chemical, or physical agents which compromise food safety or which compromise food security, in other words, which cause spoilage, can such agents be introduced in the food chain at any of these levels, or can the hazard reach a level which is not acceptable? In essence, this is a part of a concept which is called hazard analysis, critical control point, or which is also a part of risk assessment exercises in the food sector, so there is some framework above this. If you have analyzed the extent of hazards and the question in how far the hazards reach an unacceptable level, you have essentially dealt with risks. You have assessed the risk. And if you assess a risk, the next step would be to say, how can it be managed? Because when the risk is there, the management measure is necessary by definition. Otherwise, it would be a hazard. So you could say it's a negligible risk. So in this case, we assume it's a not negligible risk, so we would have to suggest a corrective action. And then we would have to ensure that this information is conveyed to the people which are actually working with game meat. So it's a rather complex thing. And first of all, you have to analyze. And scientists tend to make very small graphics with a lot of text, you see. And the good thing is that from the end of this auditorium, you cannot read it. So if there is some mistake, you won't see it. That's my advantage. If there is some mistake, I would see it, of course, but I would not tell it. So in the end, this is a schematic which draws the main steps in the process, from killing to evisceration, to transport, to cooling, and so on, and which also identifies some crucial points, some critical points to consider. And based on such an analysis, you would say, now, when we talk about biological hazards, it's typically bacteria which can multiply given a certain temperature, given a certain pH, given certain atmospheric conditions. And in this case, you would say, is there any potential in the time temperature profile for a microbiological hazard to reach an unacceptable level? In this case, you would first analyze what is the time profile in general from, let us say, time of killing to the point where the meat is cut into pieces, vacuum packaged, and deep frozen. It means to the point where the bacteria cannot multiply anymore. So you go now to a meat business and you test maybe 3,000 to 3,200 carcasses, and you just check the documentation, the traceability things, and you find out that the median value for time from killing to cutting is around 8 to 9 days, but there are some carcasses which take more than 20 days until being processed. This is a very interesting finding, since in the normal meat chain for beef and cattle, for beef and pork, we don't have this situation. After 2 or 3 days, then the meat is cut into pieces, and maybe it is matured, maybe it is aged, or it is sold directly, but we don't have this very erratic tail at the end of this distribution. When you think about the time temperature profiles in the whole chain, in this event, which can take up to 3 weeks, then you find out that, interestingly, there are several possibilities how the carcass comes to the cutting plant. It can be delivered directly from the hunter. It can go in a cooling room of the hunting area and then put in a cooling room which collects the carcasses, and from there to the cooling room of the game handling establishment, that it is called. In fact, there are 4 different possibilities, and the more blocks you see, the more time temperature breaches or potential time temperature breaches you have. This becomes highly significant when the carcass is already cold on the outside, and you remove it from the cold environment with dry air and put it to atmospheric temperature for a short time, because this air has more moisture, so you have condensation on the meat at the surface, and you can assume that this is bad for shelf life. And you can also easily demonstrate that if you start too late with cooling, the number of bacteria on the surface of the carcasses will be much higher. In this case, it's the factor of 16, not in log units, but when you think about bacterial multiplication, it's 4 times multiplication in advance when you have the carcass the first 12 hours at 18 degrees centigrade in comparison the first 12 hours at 10. Of course, the best would be to say the first 12 hours at 2 degrees centigrade, but this is not a condition we studied. So it means the cold chain is a challenge. These are situations which are not common in the meat production. In the 1950s, it was maybe state of the art to pre-cool a calf carcass or so overnight at 10 degrees centigrade. But we have abandoned this technique in pig and cattle processing. So another thing is that by the mode of killing and evisceration, you can introduce contamination to the carcass. And this contamination can now either have consequence for food security in terms that it is unfit for consumption because it has a bad smell, because it is visually contaminated, but also it can be a food safety issue in terms of transfer of bacteria which are pathogenic to humans. We tried to assess a little bit the extent of the problem and also the extent of losses in the chain due to inexpert shooting or inexpert evisceration by testing a larger quantity of wild ruminants in an approved game handling establishment, which means an approved cutting plant. And for this purpose graded the carcasses according to the appearance of the thoracal cavity. And you see here the 2 best grades, which looks quite fine, and this is together 85%, but still you have 6.5% which are delivered in a condition which which requires the whole rejection of the carcass. So you can say you have at least 6.5% losses of the killed animals due to some contamination which is man-made, which is either by shooting or evisceration. And then there is a percentage where there is at least a part of the carcass not fit for consumption. So the losses we have here at this stage are more than 10%. The question is now, are these losses only attributable to the wounding as such, or is this aggravated by the long or by the potential long time from killing to final processing to cutting? And the first step is, of course, to say, does this visual contamination have any effect on surface bacteria? Okay. And in this case, you can see quite well, the worse the condition is, the higher the bacterial counts are. So it means there is a need for clean carcasses. This means, as a measure, to say we want to have carcasses with no abdominal wounds, which means you have to differentiate where is the thoracal area, where is the abdominal area. This coincides approximately with the 7th rib, so you can make some schemes, some training schemes from this. You can also make it in a more nice mathematical way and locate the shot wounds and associate it with the degree of visible contamination. In fact, you find out that this is only one part of the story. The second part is the time temperature profile, and under the conditions of this data set, it was quite easy to see that the that the time from killing to cutting was in fact the most important predictor for bacterial surface count, and the visual cleanliness was only the second best. Of course, you see when you combine both predictors, you end up with around 70%, 63, sorry. This is because these are real data from real life, and usually you don't have 100% sums there. And of course, then there is the question how to convey it to the public. You can convey it to the scientists and the authorities. These are things from our production, that's why I show them. But you can also convey it by training courses to the people who actually cut the meat. And that's the chain. The only thing we did not consider is the consumer, of course. But this is a relatively nice approach, and I think it's an interesting example how you can work in extensive production chains and how you can analyze the major issues there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank depends a lot. As we have here more than 50% either vegetarian or vegan, I think this presentation was quite challenging for you. But I respect that you didn't run out to toilet puking, so I respect to you. Yeah, the floor is now open for questions, and please put your placard if you have one on the side so we can see you. Questions? No questions? Okay.
Hello, my name is Anna Perks, I'm from Austria, and I have a question, and I don't know if there's an answer, but when it comes to erosion of nutrients in soil, right? Is there any transboundary cooperation or any international instrument? Because I know that this is a huge challenge because of state sovereignty. Is there or is that even relevant to work closely together with, I don't know, transboundary soil treaties or agreements? Whoever is like answering.
Well, concerning the regulations, I cannot give you a good answer. One issue where this was discussed was the change in flood frequency. So that's something that is observed, that land use change is linked to increasing frequency of floods, that somehow has to do also with changing in the rainfall pattern. And in this context, there were some transboundary projects with the Czech Republic and Austria, where this issue was discussed in relation to cover cropping. Cover cropping is something that is regulated by EU laws, but very strongly dependent on like the single nation decision how it is implemented. And Austria has a pretty big amount of fields that are cover crop in order to avoid erosion, while in the Czech Republic is increasing, but it was not at that level, so there was some transboundary cooperations to exchange experience in cover cropping and thereby avoid this flood generation which is caused by high runoff due to uncovered soil. So this is what I know from one of these background problems that we faced, and where at least from the research side there was we tried to find some improvements.
Yeah, as you know, for erosion, in most countries, there is very less cooperation, transboundary cooperation, because it has not reached a state just like probably the agricultural pollutants and others that is actually affecting our waters and everything. But in as much as there's floods, there will always be erosion. So what I believe is that even though now there are no corporations actually, but what we do with IEA is that we have some sort of regional projects. The regional projects mean that within Africa, if there is a whole project with erosion, then the countries come together to see how best they will be able to tackle the issue. So at one point I realized that we have some TC, Technical Cooperation, regional projects, but I don't think that it is, the cooperation is as strong as for transboundary waters and other aspects.
Thank you. Yeah, Japan, you have been recognized.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca and I come from Italy. I wanted to ask a question about agriculture and agriculture productivity in particular. We have different models of cultivating. So, like for example, countries that prefer monoculture and big cultivations, or small producers. And apart from, of course, soil productivity and chemicals and so on are very like a determining impact. But as a model of agriculture, would you say that it is better to have big producers and big monocultures, or a lot of small producers? What is more sustainable?
I think there are two aspects involved. One is economic, and the other is like a natural scientist's point of view of using natural resources. And I want to exemplify high productivity use of natural resources because we had a student from Bangladesh where they have a very high population with limited land resources. So they have to take out the maximum per area possible. I don't know, I think the land per capita is about 0.05 hectare. So the cultivation systems are adapted in a way that all of the available resources are used. That means often that you combine different types of crops. Agroforestry is a typical example in this sense, because somehow you use resources in terms of light, or you optimize the light interception by different layers of vegetation, and you can also have the same below ground, so that you have different layers where the crops do not compete, and both, let's say, can optimize their productivity. So the per area productivity in such very small scale systems where you optimize due to combination of crops, that can be a very high productivity. The problem then comes with the economy of scales. So when the economical issue comes into discussion, then often these like small scale systems where you have a high need of workforce, a high need of input from workforce, becomes not anymore competitive. But in this respect, you have to discuss if, let's say, removing work for people is always an advantage. You know, so if you discuss, for example, no-tillage agriculture, which is something extremely interesting for us from the point of view of soil fertility, it does not need workforce. So in a lot of situations, there could be a negative social impact of no-tillage agriculture because you simply do not need so much input per hectare from working people, and giving people work means giving them social subsistence. So I think there's always an economic point of view and a kind of natural resource use point of view, and they're often conflicting. That's at least my impression.
Yeah, I think that farming is a business, and actually if you want it really to be a business, then you have to consider the small scale versus the big scale. Now labor is a problem. I don't know from most of the developed countries, but when you go to the developing countries, you realize that most of the young men, they have just left the area. Farming is no more lucrative to them. So it's only the old people who are trying to farm, and they don't have labor. So I believe that actually for a country to be self-sustained in food production, I think going in for large-scale production or commercial production is actually the way. On the other hand, those who own very small lands, and I mean they have nowhere to go. You cannot actually drive them away and then take the land. So you just allow them to continue. But if you actually want to feed the people, I believe that the best way is to go commercial and make farming a business.
My questions go to you, and I'm Antoine Ferraris from the University of Life Science. I studied at the University of Life Science in Vienna. And my question is, what are the problems actually with the isotopes? Because they sound really great, but we didn't hear a lot about the problems and the negative aspects. If there are any, or risks, and why the technology didn't deliver breakthrough yet. Thank you.
Well, as mentioned earlier on, most of the isotopes that we are using in agriculture, they are stable isotopes. They are not dangerous. As I said from the beginning of my presentation, we have isotopes in this room. We are smelling them, but you don't really see them. Even the water that we have here, when it is open, we have isotopes or oxygenating just living leaving the water. I mean, and then oxygen 16, oxygen 16 leaving and oxygen 18 remaining in this water. These are stable isotopes that are really not very, very dangerous. But I agree with you. You see, the most important thing is education. Because there are a lot of people, immediately you mention isotopes or nuclear techniques, they try to run away. It is very, very dangerous. It is a GMO, especially when it comes to a crop. The first thing they ask is it a GMO? So I think that isotopes are really, they are very good tools. They are just a tool to use to understand basic things. But we need more of education of the public for the public to realize that these isotopes are, especially the stable isotopes that we use, they are not dangerous, and there's no way that they are going to really affect the food that we eat.
Thank you. Yeah, Algeria.
Thank you. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is to the second speaker, Mr. Radu. In which countries you applied your projects, and in which country you achieved your goals most? And my second question is to all speakers. Do you have any programs or opportunities for youth to get them more involved and engage them into this kind of projects? Thank you.
Yeah. What actually we do here is that we have two types of projects in our division. We have the coordinated research project, which is more of research to develop actually methodology, which is we actually link up with most of the developed countries and also the advanced research institutes. Now, when these methodologies have been developed, we then see how these methodologies will be applicable in technical cooperation projects. And now we have, as it was mentioned earlier, we have a lot of projects. Most of them are regional projects within Latin America, within Asia, and then we also have national projects. With respect to me, as of now, I have one inter-regional project that actually cuts across the world. That means in the Pacific Islands, in the Atlantic Islands, in the African Islands, called the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States. I also have regional projects in Latin America, in Asia, and others. And then, apart from these regional projects that aims at solving a regional problem, we also have the national projects. And I have about 12, I have 12 national projects running through Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So we try as much as possible to see how best the technology that has been developed in the laboratory will work in the countries. And if they don't work very well, we bring them back to the laboratories to fine-tune those technologies. So we have the opportunities to work with most of the scientists in Africa, and also probably take part in some of the real work on the field with Maasai and others. So it is our technologies are well spread, and then we realize that we need to see how the technology from lab could realize or could generate food in the shop.
Thanks a lot. I'm looking forward also to questions regarding meat and food processed. Yes, food, please.
I'm Dhruv Sharma, and I'm a student of journalism and communication science. My question is regarding killing, animal killing. Which mode of killing can be considered as the most painless for the animals?
That's a good question. And maybe even painless is only one side of the method. You may know that there are animal ethics or animal rights considerations who say it's not the pathocentric part we should look at, but it's it's more fundamental. But the most efficient way of killing is, of course, destruction of the brain, or rendering the brain insensitive by some chemical or other agent. The second best way is to stop the blood flow and to lower the blood pressure, which causes anoxia in the brain and thus a rapid insensitivity. When you combine the hypoxia with some sort of shock, let us say by hitting the animal instantaneously, then you will not have a consciousness about the fact that the animal has been wounded. So it will maybe try to run away, and during running away it will die. That's it. Unfortunately, it's not very spectacular. Death is usually a very simple thing, unfortunately. If it would be more complicated, then maybe we could avoid it. But I hope this solved some questions.
Thanks a lot. Yes, please.
I also have a question for Professor Paulsen. Recently, due to the reactor spill in Fukushima, for example, and other pollutions in the seas, many fish and similar aquatic species became inedible. Do we have a similar problem with wild game within the continents?
It's a regional issue. The main influx was after Chernobyl, and due to the rainfalls and the geographical situation, there was a heavy contamination in the Bavarian-Czech border area. For example, Austria was affected only in very small parts, and if an animal is actually exposed, depends on his foraging behavior. If you have an animal feeding on leaves of herbs and so on shrubs and that stuff, you have the contamination going from the rain to the leaf, and this is washed away subsequently. It's washed in the ground. Now, in the forest soil, you have a low turnover, so it means you have it very well preserved. You have some of the isotopes concentrated in mushrooms, so the animals which are foraging in the ground, like wild boar, have particular high exposure, and in the Bavarian Czech area still today, so they still have some 1,000 becquerel per kilogram if it's a bad situation. And for some ruminants which have a very selective foraging behavior, which maybe feed on mushrooms selectively, they are also higher contaminated. In Austria, the Agency for Nutrition and Health, the AGES, is responsible for such surveys, and they have conducted a series of surveys and calculated consumers' exposures and found no issue. And also we have to say, in European Union, there is not a fixed maximum level of contamination for foods. It's just for import-export purposes. But for the within European trade, we just use a level, but this level was originally designated for imports and exports. That's a funny thing. So it means if you have a batch of food with a certain, I don't know, 600 becquerel or whatsoever, I'm not an expert in that, you need not only the measurement, but you need also some expertise how this measurement is to be evaluated. So the measurement as such does not allow you to make any action. You need an expertise on that. So there is no legal binding value.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, India, please.
Okay, now I know how it works. So my name is Ariane. I am from Belgium, and I have a question for you. So I read recently an article about, I don't know if you heard about it, laboratory meat. So it is in the Netherlands. They created meat from muscle cells, and they said it would be a nice way to eat meat without killing the animal. So what do you think about laboratory meat?
It's the question what you want, and in this case you have to be very decided. If you want to have meat, then it's a chemical composition and structure. If you have tissue cells which you use for this artificial meat, and you can texturize it so that it looks like meat, then of course it will also taste like meat. But the point is, in my view, it would be much better to say before we make such a complicated way to produce meat, we simply leave it. So, because it makes no sense. Either you want to eat it or you don't want to eat it. If you don't want to eat it, you can live on vegetables quite well. That's no problem for me. And because this is it's a typical scientific way. Yeah? It's good to make cells growing because maybe you can make some artificial parts of human body. And one byproduct is this meat production thing. And I don't believe in it very much because it consumes too much resources. I would rather eat tomatoes than a structurized artificial meat until the end of my life.
What a great answer. Yeah, the lady in the back, please.
Hello, my name is Vivian Angeli, and I have a question also regarding the meat, but in basic of like food security worldwide. Because meat production takes up so much resources, how do you think it will impact the food security on a worldwide scale? If, like, in terms of urbanization and changing habits of eating, like Chinese consuming much more meat because they're getting wealthier, and so on.
In a short term, this is beneficial for Europe because it compensates the losses we have because the Russian Federation does not buy pork. That's one thing. In a second way, it is also good for us because the Chinese food inspectors which come and audit the Austrian plants, for example, have very strict ideas on hygiene because they pay for it, so they want to have the best quality. That's an incentive to bring meat production to a higher level, an economic incentive. This is one thing. The other thing is, of course, that we don't only need water and energy for raising the animals, and not only feed stuff we have maybe to import from other countries, but also we have a lot of manure and soil and a lot of dung and other things we have to dispose of. So in the long run, of course, we come into problems, and I think the meat production as such is already over its limit. But it's also the consumption. And the problem that we have is consumers tend to eat what they are given or what is displayed to them in the supermarket. Whatever they tell you, they buy the things they see and which are easy to grasp. And the problem is, if we would say we would only produce high quality products with low fat, low water content, for example, only protein and so on, it would be okay. But when you, for example, when you go to certain countries, you use extenders, you use a higher percentage of fat or water to make a sausage be bigger by having a low price. So in fact, you are not only doing something bad to the environment, but you're also cheating the consumers. So the whole thing requires some corrective action. That's true, and I'm interested to see how it develops. At the moment, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a very sensitive area, and also it depends on the economic status. You realize that in some area where, rich people, on the table, you have little vegetable, you have some meat, and very little rice. You see about 10 people having very small amount of rice. But where you go to an area where the people also cannot afford meat, they eat a huge, bowl of rice. And then to produce 1 kg of rice, you also realize that you also need some water. There is some water. So it's a matter of finding the balance, and also depends on, as we discussed, the cultural background of the people. There's no way you're going to prevent the Kenyans from eating their nyama choma or their roasted meat. You cannot convince them.
I would like to add one aspect on this, because in terms of crop production, this meat consumption issue that you mentioned has changed over, let's say, 15 to 20 years. The cropping pattern, particularly in South America, dramatically. If you look in the increase in soybean production that has largely substituted land use for cattle. It is an incredible change. So also in Europe we have a discussion on protein sources. The thing that most notably you see with China with the import of soybean, the same is valid for Europe, where we are largely dependent on the import of soybean from South America. So there came up a big discussion on, because our protein crops are decreasing in terms of area due to this import, what can be done? And there were big projects how to increase the productivity of like native protein crops like fava bean and pea particularly. But we can do a lot of science on that and demonstrate how good they are. Definitely at the end it's a question of market regulation. Because farmers simply tell you we don't have sufficient income from growing pea and fava bean, because the price for protein crops is dominated by the South American import. So if you want to change cropping patterns, it's not mainly an issue of natural sciences and demonstrating how good things are, but mainly a question of political regulation of markets.
Yes, Moldova, please.
I'm not sure if this question can be answered because the topic was not covered, but my topic would be the one of the problem of salinization. And I would like to know if you know about any management options that are for the salinization of soil.
Yeah, I did not, time did not permit me to talk about salinity, and it's a really big problem in the production in a lot of countries. In fact, I came back from Muscat, Oman yesterday, and salinity is actually wiping up all the date palm. And now what the salinization, it depends on where, how the salinity is actually produced. In some areas, it's the intrusion of the seawater, because they have used the normal groundwater so much. They pump so much of the groundwater for irrigation, such that the seawater will intrude into those areas. And after some time, in fact, most of the areas now have been converted into housing. However, there could be a way of mixing brackish water in terms of reducing the amount of water that you pump, and then probably use treated wastewater for irrigation, so that you'll be able to actually limit the amount of water that you pump from the system. But in some other countries where I've been in Bangladesh, some of them are also human salinity created by humans, that they intentionally bring the seawater into the rice fields in order to cultivate shrimps, which has a very, very high price for them. So when you ask them to stop this, the argument is that food security means if I can get a high amount of money. So cultivating shrimp is per area is more lucrative than putting or cultivating rice. So yes, there are ways to do it, using the mixing the wastewater and using it for irrigation. In terms of isotopes, as I mentioned, you can also use the carbon isotope discrimination, but this is not a management issue. It's just to identify crop plants that are tolerant to salinity. And you know, salinity actually also goes with water use efficiency. When there is high salinity, plants cannot take water, so they go together. So the same principle for carbon isotope discrimination for water use efficiency is also used as a surrogate for plants that are tolerant to salinity.
I would just add a very short issue, which I would say is interesting for the European areas. You mentioned the seawater intrusion. One problem that is coming up with seawater intrusion is related to tourism. in the Mediterranean area. So you have tourists that go there, which are the predominant economic sector in a lot of countries. So predominant economically means they decide. And tourists generally shower 3 times a day when they are in summer holidays. And this has induced, for example, in parts of Italy, of Sardinia, for example, has induced exactly this problem of seawater intrusion, and thereby increasing problems of salinization areas where traditionally this was not a problem. But as you said, there are ways to deal with this, but somehow you have to, at the bigger scale, you have to analyze what are the backgrounds, why this problem is increasing, which are partially problems related to climate change, partially with improper management, but partially also with these competing sectors where agriculture is somehow facing a difficult situation that is hard to be solved by agriculture technically themselves, but requires somehow a large-scale intervention of water management.
Yeah, and, just to what he said, now our division, our session is actually, we have a coordinated research project looking at land use and then how to actually reduce salinity. What is the best way actually to make sure that salinity is reduced? But salinity is a very complicated issue. Some time ago we all believed, or we all thought that salinity was due to sodium chloride, I mean salt, when we say salt. But now it has come out for us to know that salinity is not always due to sodium. In some areas it could be due to calcium, it could be due to magnesium, or it could be due to some other elements. So we need more research into it, and this is where I feel that isotope can play a very important role.
Thank you. Yes, please.
To Mr. Paulsen, you told about the relevance of the game meat for food security. Well, you actually were saying about, like, for example, you took the example of Scotland, but in regards to countries that are developing, like, I remember the picture of a fruit bat, which is also one of the protein sources in some countries. Could that be, like, also for the future, also for food security, some relevance? And how would then the food safety, what would you recommend for the food safety for these countries then, if they have the bushmeat, for example?
Yeah, you have already mentioned the keyword bushmeat, and my experiences with such food chains are relatively limited. And for example, even in Thailand, where you would not accept it, assume it, you would not think about it, there is some sort of bushmeat and there are some incidents with it, but generally you could say that most of these traditional things are prepared in a traditional way, which I would say simply kills most of the pathogenic agents. Not all of them, but you have a high degree of safety, and one of the major things is very simple: to cook it, to boil it, to have it hot. Even when it is served steaming hot, this is a good thing. And this is one answer as regards food safety. Of course, this does not mean that there are not specific measures necessary, and this is a task for research activities to find out why is a food chain safe, under which conditions is it safe, and what are the conditions where it could be unsafe, what are the potential dangers. This is one thing. And the other thing as regards food security, of course it is only a small contribution to food security, but there are maybe certain regions where it will have high importance. And it also depends on how much meat you really want to consume. If we say, for example, in Austria 1% of the average meat consumption is provided by meat from wild game, this sounds not very much, but when we say maybe we consume 50% too much, then it would be 2% of the share. And if you would make the chain more efficient, it could be 5% of the or more of the meat share. So you could improve it a little bit, and you could also reduce the average consumption a little bit, and I think this would help. That's the point. It's a small solution to a big problem, but if I would have a big solution, it would be maybe a very big man like Donald Trump or Putin or Erdogan or whoever.
Great. You wanted to say something? Is it answer or?
My question was directed to Professor Bodner. You were talking about the task of increasing the yield, increasing the efficiency. In this context, what is your opinion on GM and what are the possible risks of it? Thank you.
Well, that's actually a very interesting debate because now with the new CRISPR-Cas technology, we have something like a new technology available which might change a lot in this issue of GM, and there's still a discussion ongoing. I don't think that it is legally resolved so far if this is to be considered GM or not. Somehow my personal approach or opinion on this is, first of all, if you look on the release of cultivars worldwide, I don't know the numbers are 100% exact, but 70 to 80% are still cultivars that are released by traditional breeding methods. So GM and biotechnology in breeding has been something very interesting and important for some breeding activities, but not for all. So we have to also find technologies that are adapted to conventional breeding, because still it's the predominant part of plant breeding. Second, you have to see where such high-tech breeding activities can fit. This, for me, is partially one discussion that fits for Austria. It could be, or should we really try to use a technology that might require such large-scale capital background that it would outcompete part of our breeding activities that try to cover our market. Because plant breeding is something that you could orient to a very large market, to very large environments, or you can orient it more to some specific environment. That evidently our national breeders are more oriented to our national market with some activity towards Eastern Europe, and I would like that these breeding activities still continue because they are covering more or less the needs of our environment. And in this context, very high tech, they would not be competitive. So from a scientific point of view, I'm very open towards these technologies. I don't think as much in these high-tech things you have proofs for this and that. So at the end, it's somehow a democratic decision, and it's a decision if you, at the same time, if you just focus on one technology, or if you try to develop also breeding technologies to improve this from other approaches.
Thanks a lot. Yes, Adriana.
Thank you. I'm Adriana and I'm from Italy originally. And my question goes to Mr. Adu Bianfi. It concerns the wider question of crop management techniques like crop rotation in Africa, so that's why I'm posing it to you. And I'm asking this in the context of whether you see that there's still a lot of potential in implementing crop rotation into cropping and other agroecological methods to increase the biological soil fertility and increase yields, because I feel that sometimes a lot of effort is put into increasing the chemical inputs, and this is also where I've read about criticism of alliances in Africa, like for example, I have to read it out, the Alliance for a Green Revolution of the Gates and Rockefeller Fund, or the Grow Africa Alliance of the World Economic Forum, that are on one hand pushing for progress in Africa, but they're criticized for putting a lot of effort into pushing fertilizer application, chemical application, and more, so this input side of the equation and promoting agribusinesses. So my question is, what is the potential of agroecological practices on small farms and on big farms, and are these agroecological practices considered enough? And are there any big alliances of African countries to push these practices and not to focus on chemical inputs and the nutrition side of the equation, but also like the agroeconomic side? So that's my question. Thank you.
That's a good question, and I want to also congratulate you for mentioning my name really very well. I think you are the first person who have been able to mentioned my surname really very well, Janfi. Thank you very much. I think now, if you look at crop rotation, especially not just the crop rotation, but rotating crops with legumes, have a very big potential in the African agriculture, in terms of the fact that most of the farmers are not able to afford buying nitrogen fertilizers or some other fertilizers. See, the only some of the main problems with this crop rotation, actually, when it becomes like intercropping, then it is a problem. But if you have strip cropping, because if you want to go into large farms, I mean commercial farms, you want to mechanize. And when you want to mechanize, you cannot mix both the legumes. But if you strip them, if you have all the cereals, probably 4 or 6 lines, and then the legumes, and then the next time you switch off, wherever you planted the legume, you can also put the cereal. Then in this case, it is really very easy to mechanize, and I see that it has a potential. With respect to nitrogen fertilizers, I will not agree with anyone who will say that we should not put any nitrogen fertilizers for crop production, because if you look at the nitrogen percentage in the plant, actually your yield, ability to produce yield, will depend on the amount of inorganic fertilizers that you put there. Organic fertilizers, yes, many people would like to go in for manure, to use manure or something as organic fertilizer. But there is a caution. As we all know, garbage in, garbage out. Sometimes the manures contain nothing because the crops themselves doesn't have any nutrients. So when you give it to the animals, there's no way that in the rumen the animals are going to increase the fertility, so that you can have the manure all right, but nothing will actually come out for crop production. So I believe that to sustain crop productivity, we need these inorganic fertilizers, but mixed with these cropping systems where we can have more legumes. The more legumes you have in the cropping systems, I mean, the better you improve the nitrogen capital. So I would say that, well, it has a future. Crop rotation or strip cropping or whatever you call it has a future in most of these African countries. But I still feel that if you look at the fertilizer use in most of the African countries, on the average, I think the nitrogen is almost about 7 to 10 kilograms and per hectare. I mean, on the average, which is very, very, very low. And with this amount, there is no way you are going to sustain maize yield of about 4 tons. You cannot even get 4 tons. So I feel that the two should go together. But the most important thing, as we said, is the management, to make sure that the inorganic fertilizer that you are putting for the crops are taken up by the crops and not really wasted.
Thanks a lot. One short question. You want to do a short follow-up question?
Just because I asked also about pesticides, just to see what is your point, not because the most controversial part is the pesticides and insecticides. So are they used in an appropriate way at the moment? And do we need more application, or should we go more from natural pest management, for example? Just to clarify also the pesticides part of this question.
Yeah, the pesticides in most areas, well, it has come about because of this intensification of agriculture. Some years ago, I mean, people were moving from one field to the other, and because of this, weed infestation was very, very, very low. Now, when you intensify, then you increase the wheat production, so that when there is so much wheat and labor is a problem, then the obvious course is to go in for a weedicide or pesticide. But sometimes for the sake of people who want organic food and they don't want any pesticides to be applied, they actually go in for this. But there are certain crops, from my own experience, actually I work with ITA and Equisa. You cannot grow cowpeas without spraying. You will not get anything. So you have to decide whether you just want to have the organic cowpea where you will not have any production at all, or you will rather time what we do is that sometimes you grow it with another crop where most of the pests will rather go to the other crop and then you spray. And in some cases you can save the cowpea and make it really insect-free. But for weedicides, I believe that in as much as labor is going to be a problem in most African countries, weedicides will continue to be used.
So, one last question. You wanted to address one?
Hello, maybe I could formulate the question as a yes-no question to Professor Bodmer. It's a rather technical question. I want to excuse myself for that, but I'm really curious about it. On the first view, it looks as if you are facing a one-dimensional problem, so it's just all about the crop. But as you described very impressive in your presentation, it's higher dimensional, so it's about the soil, water, fertilizing and everything. But the higher the dimension, the more complicated it is to understand the process and the more complicated it is to optimize the process. So is it common in your research field to use high computer science like machine learning approaches, multi-objective evolutionary algorithm to understand the processes and to optimize the process?
Actually, the specific part of machine learning we are just now applying in the context of phenotyping, in plant phenotyping. That's something like, you get high-dimensional imaging data where you can use this machine learning to get out features, biological features. But for this problem of like, say, multi-dimensional stresses or interactions, still the most common issue is to use agroecosystem models. So agroecosystem models means you have something like trying to reproduce physical and biological processes via mathematical equations, and you analyze scenarios. That means you have a crop growth model that more or less reproduces the needs of your crop. You have a soil model that reproduces water flow and nutrient release, and in this way you can somehow simulate different environmental scenarios and stresses and look what could be an expected outcome. So this is the most common way, I would say, to put together specific knowledge on an agroecosystem level and see how you could, at least theoretically, in silico optimize management.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for interesting questions, for great presentations. Like I said, I really become now a soil expert. That's really good. You got me in that. And also very interesting about the meat. And we had here really international meat expert. So I thank a lot for your time. And as we are Green Meeting certified, we have a small thank to you as well. It's you made it for me, please. So it's a reusable coffee cup and USB stick. You also have all the conference materials on it. Also a bottle of wine, organic wine. Yes, try the isotopes. I'm looking forward to the outcome. Thank you very much for this. Thanks a lot. Yeah. 10 minutes coffee break. I've seen some tired faces, so I think this is useful. Also try to get some fresh air. I mean, you can also go out in the Memorial Plaza and get some more oxygen. I think it's neat. Okay, see you please here at the quarter past. Thank you.